Hi, good morning. I'm Chidiogo Ofebu. I'm one of the Harris County Attorney interns right now. Next up, we have Gloria Ubaldo and Desiree Salinas, who will speak on detention and release of unaccompanied children. Gloria Ubaldo is a staff attorney with KIND Houston's detained team. Prior to working for KIND, Gloria represented detained and released unaccompanied minors with Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Galveston, Houston. She received her Bachelor's of Arts in both Political Science and Communications from University of Houston and her JD from South Texas College of Law. Gloria is licensed to practice law in Texas. And we have Desiree Salinas, who is one of the managing attorneys of St. Francis Cabrini Center for Immigrant Legal Assistance in Houston, Texas. Cabrini Center is the largest legal service provider for unaccompanied children in the Houston area. She manages and supervises attorneys, DOJ accredited representatives, and paralegals who work in the unaccompanied minor program of the Cabrini Center. This includes overseeing the work performed at 6 different Greater Houston areas or shelters for detained unaccompanied children, as well as the continued direct representation of these minors released in the Houston area and young adults detained in local ICE facilities. She also provides direct representation to minor clients, practicing in front of USCIS, the Asylum Office, and the Houston and Montgomery Immigration Court. Desiree often speaks at community events on various topics affecting unaccompanied immigrant children. Desiree attended SMU in Dallas for her undergraduate degree and then South Texas College of Law. She is also a native of Houston and continues to work with her local community through outreaches year-round. And at the end, the audience will have 10 minutes of Q&A with these ladies as well.
Thank you. Thank you. So good morning. Today we're going to be going over the detention and the release of unaccompanied minors. There you go. Yep. So a quick overview before we get started. We're going to go over how the journey of the unaccompanied minors begins as they arrive here in the country, and then as they're transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Some of the protections that are offered to these minors while they're here, the intake and placement while they're in the OR facilities, and what is the process for them to be released from the OR facilities to a sponsor here in the country, which is referred to as reunification.
All right, so it's a little segue from what Ann and Jerry were speaking of earlier. So the apprehension of UAC minors and where we get this terminology from. So when a minor arrives at or near the border and they cross without the accompaniment of a parent, they're designated by either U.S. Customs and Border Protection or the U.S. Customs Enforcement as an unaccompanied child. UAC. So this can be done also at a port of entry. Also internally, if a minor crosses at the border and then they're apprehended for any type of criminal matter, say they're driving without a license, but they are undocumented and remain a minor, they can be picked up by immigration officials during any of this time that they're in the juvenile justice proceedings.
So any person that's taken into DHS custody, either by CBP or ICE, who appears to be a UAC, is then placed in the temporary DHS facilities. These are what Ann was mentioned, were the facilities that they're cold and the children perhaps are not getting the attention that they need yet. They're still being determined whether they are a UAC. They receive an interview while they're in the facility, which CBP or ICE will then use to determine if they are in fact unaccompanied at under 18. If this determination is made, then they are referred to ORR. This referral means that the child needs to be taken and placed into the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement within 72 hours. This is not always happening within this 72-hour period. We have come in contact with many minors who tell us, and we know by the records, they actually can spend up to 10 days waiting for these transfers to actually happen. These transfers take place 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That means that it could be at 2 or 3 in the morning when the child is picked up from this DHS detention facility and transferred to one of the OR shelters.
So Anne mentioned kind of the Flores regulations and the Flores settlement agreement. We also have the TVPRA, which is the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008, which offers firm protections for our unaccompanied children in and out of the courtroom. There's also some special rules that apply to children that come from contiguous countries like Mexico and Canada. So they're supposed to be given the opportunity to have a hearing before an immigration judge, and they can ask to be immediately returned to their home country. It's called voluntary departure, but there's many times where CBP or ICE speak to the minor and they might feel that they are the victim of trafficking. There might be some different circumstances as to the story of the minor, of like how they arrived at the border, the circumstances of the reasons why they came, and if there's any particular risk for trafficking, or if the minors express fear, then CBP does have the opportunity under the TVPRA to refer them to ORR instead of returning them to their country immediately.
So the Office of Refugee Resettlement is actually a department under the Health and Human Services, big umbrella that covers a lot of other different agencies and departments. So within ORR, we have the Division of Unaccompanied Children, which is actually the one that is in charge of seeing all these transfers and in charge of the process that happens with the children.
Okay, so the intake and placement with ORR. So ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, maintains a network of shelters around the country. So there can be some up in Seattle, Oregon. There's a number here in Texas and all throughout the Northeast. So the determination of the placement of ORR depends on a number of different factors. It can be related to the child's medical condition if they come in with any kind of special needs, any mental health needs, if the child appears to be a danger to themselves or others. All these factors go into the determination of what type of placement this child will be set for in ORR. There's a number of different subcontractors and facilities that run these shelters. There's a large network of programs run by Southwest Key, BCFS, and International Education Services, and so they run the programs for these ORR shelters throughout the nation.
Within all these different shelters that ORR manages, we have different types of facilities. So some facilities focus on children, for example, who are between the ages of 16 and 17. Some are for tender age children. We also have, OR also has facilities that are referred to as residential treatment centers, or long-term foster care facilities, or staff secure facilities. All of these shelters we have across the country, and they're specialized in meeting the needs of the children that are placed there. The children don't necessarily stay within one shelter once they're transferred. If there are needs identified by the shelter facility, then they will transfer the child to a facility that can meet those needs.
So here are some pictures of what some of the typical shelters look like. And while UAC is in ORR care, they're given some medical treatment. So this can be a number of different things, right? So there's a lot of minors in closed facilities, and so they need to treat against, measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox. The conditions aren't always the best for maintaining infectious diseases, right? So medical is always important for UACs to get while they're in OR care, so it can range from vaccinations to anything more heightened. Unfortunately, both Gloria and I have had clients and minors that have come to the U.S. and while they're in ORR care, it's been discovered that they have a more grave medical needs. So, for example, we both had clients with cancer or broken bones, and so it's not just vaccinations that they can receive in ORR care, but it's also more invasive medical treatment. Medical health needs are also met while the children are in ORR care. Every shelter has at least one clinician that meets with the minors and is set to meet with for their mental health needs. They receive classroom instruction and some education. Many of them start to learn English as soon as they arrive at the shelters. Recreation, they also spend some time outside. They also offer minors different field trip opportunities. A lot of times they'll do different things during the holidays. They just celebrated Halloween at all the shelters, so that was something big for them. And probably the most important is legal services. So every shelter should have a legal service provider that is assigned to that shelter and goes and meets with the children and gives them a Know Your Rights presentation within 10 days of them arriving at the shelter, and then follows up to help assess their legal needs. And finally, the shelter is not meant for detention, but for family reunification. So the shelter case managers will work on reunifying these minors with an available sponsor in the nation.
So since the main role of the shelter is family reunification, as soon as the child arrives into the shelter, they again will receive another sort of interview where the case manager and the shelter staff assess and try to figure out how they can begin finding somebody in the country who can perhaps sponsor the child. Once they have somebody identified, or if they don't have anybody in the country, they are put into these categories. So it's basically category 1 through 4. The children that will remain in the shelter the longest are the category 4 children who don't have a sponsor identified. Perhaps there's nobody in this country who is related to them, or they just didn't have a plan as to who they would have lived with as soon as they arrive here. Category 1 is for somebody who has a parent or a legal guardian here in the country. And so at that point, if they're considered a category 1, then the reunification process begins, where ORR actually will put the sponsor through a process to make sure that it's a safe place for the child to go and to be released. And then there are several things that the sponsors need to comply with, background checks. Some of them may have to do home studies or have post-release services to follow up with the child after they're released with a sponsor.
So there was a previous question in the last panel about how many UACs are currently in the Houston area. And we mentioned in a previous slide that there's about 7 shelters in the Houston area that have UACs. We're actually in somewhat of a downtime, low numbers at all the shelters. And between Gloria and I, we estimate there's probably less than 500 minors currently being detained in Houston area shelters. The average length of time that a UAC remained in ORR care for the last fiscal year was about 60 days. And then for this fiscal year, there was a total of 9,381 minors released to sponsors in Texas, and a little over 4,000 were released to sponsors in Harris County. It says it up there. There was about 9,381 in Texas, and then a little over 4,000 released in Harris County.
So what happens if a minor turns 18 years old and there is no reunification that was possible before that? There are other options and other possibilities for a minor who doesn't have a qualifying relative, and they do qualify for legal relief. That means that one of the legal service provider attorneys has gone in and assessed the minor's case and identified the possibility of legal relief. Then they can perhaps qualify for long-term foster care placement. Now this identification and the actual referral need to happen before the child is 17.5 or 17 and a half years old. These long-term foster care placements happen throughout the country, so it's not necessarily known if there will be a bed available or a placement available. It's a referral system. Another thing that can happen when the child turns 18 years old is the attorney and the shelter can work on what's called a release on recognizance or release to entity. That would mean it's a request that the child be released, perhaps to a facility that can take care of the child after they turn 18. And this is a practice that happens throughout the country, and whether or not they get accepted, it varies a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Now, if perhaps they were not accepted into a long-term foster care facility and their release on recognizance request was denied, then at their 18th birthday, they will be transferred to an adult detention facility on their birthday.
So here we have a few statistics of what children are coming, what is the makeup of the UACs. So we identify Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador as the Northern Triangle. This is the large majority of where minors are coming from. So in, I believe, fiscal year 2018, 71% of the minors were male, and the majority were between the ages of 15 and 16 years old, and 54% came from Guatemala. I know recently at a few of our shelters we've been seeing a large number of minors coming from India, from Brazil, from China, so a lot of different countries outside of the Northern Triangle, which is the majority of the makeup of UACs.
And that is it. Do we have any questions?
You mentioned there's some protections for children that have been trafficked. How is it determined that they've been trafficked?
So there's a number of different factors that go into this determination. Obviously, the information given from the minor. There's probably investigation done after interviewing the minor. Also, yeah, I was thinking of letters. There's also another organization called the Young Center who will be at later panels today, I believe. They provide services as child advocates, so also meeting with the minor or the legal service provider. If information is given to either the legal service provider or a child advocate, it can be determined that the child may qualify for trafficking. Yes.
Yes, it's a gray area, but it does. When a child is released or not released, transferred out of an OR facility, they will lose their UAC status. So their ability to apply affirmatively for asylum is gone. So it does make it more difficult. Release from an adult facility also is not anything like it is released from an OR shelter, where perhaps the shelter was looking for a sponsor or somebody who could take care of the child. In an adult setting, there are proceedings before a judge who may or may not grant a bond, which of course the child may not have the funds or ability to pay that bond to even be released. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.